Good afternoon. As you are gathering, I invite you to, as needed, kind of move back and forth and get coffee and sweets. I want to welcome you to Boston University and also to this afternoon forum titled Theology is Living Discourse, The Future of Feminist Practical Theology. I'm Shelley Rambo, and I've had the delight of co-coordinating this panel with several people on it, and I want to just preliminarily thank some people who have made this event happen. I really want to thank the Center for Practical Theology at Boston University for making possible our ongoing conversations, especially to Claire Wolfteich, Dale Andrews, and Brian Stone. Special thanks to Holly Reed, the assistant in the Center for Practical Theology, who worked with me and can confirm that I am not an event planner. So I want to thank her for picking up a lot of the loose ends on this event. Also Atula Jameer, who has been working as a student assistant with our team, and she'll be making the introductions of the persons on the panel. Deborah Chi, who provided the artwork for this. Also Adam Wallace for helping on the design. I want to thank BU Productions, Catering, and others who have provided us the space and the food. Most of all, I want to thank the speakers, who we were very surprised and delighted that all the people that we asked to be on this panel said yes, and said yes rather immediately. So we're thrilled to have them here. Like many events such as this, its origins arose over the exchange of beverages. A cup of coffee with Amy Hollywood at Oxford Spa, asking what is the future of feminist theology and how do I teach it? An afternoon beverage with Brian Stone. Does practical theology share the liberative agendas of feminist and womanist theologies? More beverages with Susan Abraham and Donna Freitas, asking how are we situated at our respective institutions in relationship to feminist and practical theologies? What are the implications of filling certain institutional positions? These conversations were given new form by when Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore arrived, and we received a grant from the Center for Practical Theology to more formally explore the nature of the relationship between feminist and practical theologies. The planning team, Dean Moore, Susan Abraham, Renee Harrison, Donna Freitas, and I have been meeting and emailing over the past 6 months, exploring the relationship between feminist theologies and practical theology. Both view theology as a lived and living discourse that shapes persons and communities. What happens when the two are brought together? Susan reminded me that our conversations took a pretty distinctive turn when I returned from a practical theology conference. I was disturbed and honestly surprised by how homogeneous the group was. Gender, race, class, sexual orientation. There was little said about these issues, little represented in terms of the makeup of the members. While the conversation claimed to be a new one, other things suggested that not much had changed at all. Is it possible to forge a new conversation when certain things remain unquestioned, unrepresented, absent? It prompted us to ask what a feminist practical theological discourse might look like. What form does it take? Who is its audience? We understand this afternoon's panel to be the beginning of a conversation. We have not agreed as a panel on a definition of feminist practical theology. Instead, we intend this evening's panel as an opportunity to explore definitions and ask probing questions. We wanted this to be primarily a Boston conversation in order to foster something ongoing, drawing scholars and religious leaders in the Boston area to engage in these questions. We hope to lure many of you into this ongoing conversation by offering what we view today as theological appetizers. Based on your feedback, questions, and interest, we will shape the next steps. Our hope is that a conversation engaging these questions will reveal a matrix of theological voices that translate across multiple contexts: church, academy, society, and world. The format of this afternoon's discussion: we have paired scholars, asking a scholar more junior in her field to respond to the work of a more senior scholar in light of three interrelated questions. Why is feminist practical theology feminist? Why is feminist practical theology practical? And why is feminist practical theology theology? So we will have 10-minute provocations. I didn't say younger scholars, I said more junior scholars. So 10-minute provocations from the more junior scholars, followed by 10-minute responses from the less junior scholars. Have to be very careful here. What we're going to do in terms of format is, you see we have a lot of provocations and responses packed into a short amount of time. So what we're going to do is move through the panel, and as speakers are speaking and your questions arise, we invite you to write down questions and deposit them, or somehow find a way to make their way over to a Tula, and there will be a sorting out process, and we'll engage some of the questions at the end. If people were willing to stay for an extra hour, we could entertain that, but we're pushing people's schedule with 2 hours. So I just want to say, as closing the introduction, that it's important to note that this event concludes a week-long celebration of Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore's installation as Dean at Boston University School of Theology. We, of course, don't mean to say this is the conclusion of her time as dean. We see this as really an occasion to honor her scholarship, a forerunner in the intersection of these fields between feminist and practical theologies. So we are honored to recognize her scholarship and her presence, and to join her in thinking together about the nature and future of feminist practical theology.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm greatly honored to introduce our distinguished panelists this afternoon. Susan Abraham is Assistant Professor of Women's Studies and Ministry Studies at Harvard Divinity School, whose teaching and research explores post-colonial feminist theological practices, invigorating contemporary communities of faith. Amy Hollywood is the Elizabeth H. Munrad Professor of Christian Studies at Harvard Divinity School, and is a historian of Christian thought, specializing in mysticism, feminist theory, queer theory, psychoanalysis, and continental philosophy. Renee K. Harrison is Assistant Professor of African American Religious Practices and Culture at Payne Theological Seminary, and author of Enslaved Women and the Art of Resistance in Antebellum America. M. Sean Copeland holds a joint appointment at Boston College in the Department of Theology, teaching courses in theological anthropology, social suffering, and religious experience, and in the program in African and African diaspora studies, teaching courses in critical theories of race and African American intellectual history and culture. Donna Freitas is a visiting scholar of religion at Boston University and author of Sex and the Soul: Juggling Sexuality, Spirituality, Romance, and Religion on America's College Campuses. And This Gorgeous Game, her second novel, forthcoming in April 2009. Stephanie Paulsell is the Houghton Professor of the Practice of Ministry Studies at Harvard Divinity School. She is the author of Honoring the Body: Meditations on a Christian Practice, The Scope of Our Art, The Vocation of the Theological Teacher, and numerous essays on religion and literature, Christian spirituality, and theological education. Shelley Rambo is Assistant Professor of Theology at Boston University's School of Theology. She teaches courses in feminist and womanist theologies, and her research focuses on the relationship between trauma and theology. Her most recent work, Trauma and Redemption, is coming out this summer. Mary Elizabeth Molino Moore is Dean of the School of Theology and Professor of Theology and Education, Boston University. Her recent books include Teaching as a Sacramental Act, Ministering with the Earth, and Teaching from the Heart, plus the co-edited volumes, Children, Youth, and Spirituality in a Troubling World, and Practical Theology and Hermeneutics. She has also written many articles on education, process and feminist theologies, and justice and reconciliation.
Thank you, Atula, and thank you, Shelley. I've already been asked multiple times whether I was crazy to take on Amy Hollywood. And having said that, here goes. So my reflection on Professor Hollywood's work in relation to practical theology is based in a single but very influential essay. It's been published multiple times, titled Practice, Belief, and the Feminist Philosophy of Religion. In choosing to focus on one essay rather than on her whole work, I'm attempting to refract a set of issues identifiable with her through the lens of one of the orienting questions that we had for the symposium. I suggest that feminist practical theology is theology, precisely because it meets the requirements which Hollywood outlines in her essay for an account of how practices and beliefs cohere. Nevertheless, I will not be arguing that Professor Hollywood transformed herself into a theologian, but that the conversation about the manner in which beliefs and practices cohere, in feminist philosophy, for example, necessarily engage theology. In evaluating feminist interventions in the philosophy of religion, Hollywood points out that feminist philosophers of religion, such as Pamela Sue Anderson and Grace Janssen, both emphasize belief. This continues the trend, somewhat disturbing in my opinion, in analytic philosophy, which grapples, sometimes exclusively, with the attempt to justify or redefine belief. Anderson and Janssen, however, as constructive philosophers, mobilize forms of modified Kantianism, or in the case of Janssen, an aspect of Feuerbach's theory of projection to present a constructive theological realism. However, their constructive theological realist argument is unconvincing to most religious people. To put it simply, the God of these feminist philosophers is unrecognizable to anybody. Thus, even as feminist philosophers present, quote, ameliorative reconceptions of what is meant by religious belief, end quote, these are Hollywood's words, it remains difficult to align their ideas with more widely held understandings of what the object of religious belief, that is God, looks like and what it does. Here is where Hollywood argues strongly that feminist philosophers of religion ought to examine the practices of religious people, since the ontological status of the objects of religious belief cannot be resolved merely by redefining the nature of divine existence in terms of regulatory ideals, whether they are epistemological or moral. Further, since religion cannot be solely equated with belief, philosophers of religion ought to take into account the function and the meaning of practice. However, there is a caution, which Hollywood points us to. There is a colonial frame in which practice has traditionally been framed. As post-colonial anthropologist and historian Talal Asad demonstrates in his very famous book, Genealogies of Religion, if we identify religious practice as simply ritual, for example, we expose ourselves to a number of pitfalls. the very definition of religion and ritual is dependent on an European and Protestant perspective. For example, European Protestantism values belief over ritual. This is in reaction to Catholicism. And further attaches ritual problematically to belief systems. In such a view, ritual is understood to operate symbolically. Instrumental actions which identify one as part of a religious community, here I would think of examples such as feeding the poor, clothing the naked, etc., are relegated to what is called the practical realm, severing it from a larger belief system. For feminist philosophers wrestling with the manner in which the conversation is structured, it'll be fruitless to think of practice in this preconceived dualistic manner. Instead, suggests Hollywood, a concept called habitus would be a better candidate for feminist philosophers when examining practice for their theological realist arguments. What is habitus? It is forms of practice marked by religious convictions, cultural and social contexts, and includes even those practices that are removed from the symbolic. It can include, for example, gait, the way one walks, athletic styles, manners of sleeping and eating, clothing, birth and nursing patterns, among others. Habitus is a form of bodily practice which forms subjectivity, it inculcates virtues, and embodies belief. I wonder, though, how would a feminist philosopher attempt to describe embodied belief? What conceptual category would be useful here, which indicates not only a commitment to inhabiting a belief system? If that were the case, habitus would suffice. But the commitment as a feminist to reflect critically about religious experience, religious belonging, and religious expression. So I'm looking for another concept. Habitus is one, I'm looking for something else. I think that the feminist philosopher is doubly challenged here. Habitus would challenge the feminist philosopher to take the theological worldview in which a particular religious practice makes sense, while the commitment to examining the communicative, cognitive, constitutive, and affective framework in which such a view is asserted necessarily engages the normative and prescriptive. In other words, she has to take into account belief, but coming at it from a very critical perspective. I'm raising this issue not because I think Professor Hollywood or feminist philosophers of religion are inimical to such a conversation. This is not at all the case. This is not why I'm asking this. I'm asking this because of another pain I have. There is a double challenge, I think, because of the secularized context in which our universities operate. There is a disdain towards theology in general. Feminist theology operates in its own academic black hole. And feminist practical theology is perceived as a serious dis-ease because it is an intensification of two things. They are so subjective that they are feminist, and then they are so subjective, they're theological. So it's a double whammy. So the question I'm asking is, how do those of us who are committed to both a feminist practice as well as a theological, solidly theological, how do we hold on to this? If the lived reality of religious practitioners as embodied belief is to be central to the feminist philosophy of religion, theology, and feminist theology in particular, must challenge the discursive boundaries of both philosophy and theology. So from the one side, it challenges theology. From the other side, it challenges philosophy. The move to reconstruction in such a view is inevitable. When it reconstructs, it becomes normative and prescriptive for, to use Hollywood's words, the ameliorative reconception of philosophical and theological domains necessarily becomes the result of alliances and solidarities to challenge academic conventions. Precisely because of the coherence of reason and desire, the habitus of those inhabiting belief systems may not exist apart from a critical discernment about the institutional forms of life, particularly their religious life. Hollywood's example, that of Margaret Ebner, a German Dominican nun who explicitly articulates the way in which her meditation on Christ's passion actually inhibits her from really seeing Christ's passion, but makes her an actor of Christ's passion. This is very important. She just doesn't look at it. She just doesn't apprehend it. She instead internalizes it and begins to embody it. This was Ebner's habitus. This was her practice. Predictably, this habitus invited censure. Some men argued that Ebner ought not to identify with Christ's suffering, but with Mary's suffering at the foot of the cross. Ebner's persistence in embodying her understanding of the coherence of belief and practice points, in many ways, as Professor Hollywood points out, to the tolerance in the later Middle Ages for performances of gender fluidity. In other words, her identifying with this male body, this male suffering, was tolerated. Why? Because there was a tolerance for gender fluidity. But I'm saying, Ebner is not only performing gender here, she's also producing knowledge through her specific vision of how beliefs and practices cohere. What she's producing through her persistent practice of gender fluidity, if you will, is theological knowledge. And it is not brand new theological knowledge. The very fact of her persistent practice and its acceptance speaks to a framework which is hospitable to such practices. So whatever we might want to say about women who do drag, the other way around, I guess, and do masculinity in this way, we have to understand there is a framework in which this makes sense. So it's already theological, in my opinion. Consequently, while Hollywood presents us with the concept habitus to understand religious practice holistically and critically, its theological mooring seems less stable, in my reading. I wonder if feminist philosophers would accept a more theological concept, one with much significance for feminist practical theology, to perform the task of critical theological realism. The concept that I want to mobilize, feminist praxis, captures the critical and theological tasks facing those who wish to examine the coherence of beliefs and practices. Thus, Ebner's religious practice is not just practice, it is feminist praxis. She embodies a vision of a self and community under God and articulates a theology of the coherence of belief and practice which she enacts in her body. Obviously, she subverts not only gender expectations as they are applied to non-women in her time and ours, but also epistemological ones regarding the nature of knowledge or the boundaries of knowledge. But her praxis, arising from a theological habitus, results in a theology which is not alien. Her habitus is theological, which reminds us, of course, that the original meaning of theology, credo ut intelligam, is habitus. Theology meant a habitus. And as Letty Russell was fond of reminding us all, feminist theology is theology. So my specific question to Hollywood is here. What are some ways then a feminist philosophy of religion can, or does it already, as it does implicitly in your essay, engage with the habitus as a theology of praxis? Thank you.
First, thanks very much to Shelley and the other organizers for inviting me to this event, which is one that I find myself curiously in and out of, but feeling more in right now than I thought perhaps I might. And thanks especially, Susan, for your really wonderful engagement with this piece that I wrote in response to a very specific question. And I want to say a little bit about the context of that response by way of response to your question, because I absolutely agree. I mean, my response to the whole paper would be yes, absolutely yes. You know, habitus and feminist praxis, one of the questions is how we think about habitus as a mode in which we are inculcated into certain forms of sociology and subjectivity, while at the same time understanding ourselves as being able to stand in a critical relationship to ourselves and our own practices, and to reform our practices through engagement with new modes of life, new modes of action, new modes of thinking. And that thinking is always part of it, that there's always a cognitive dimension to all of these practical engagements, both in the form of shaping what practices we decide to engage in, and also as coming out of particular kinds of practices. So I absolutely agree with everything you have to say here about the kind of unmooredness from theology doing a disservice to the richness of the notion of habitus, and also looking like it might be in danger of losing a critical component that's central to any feminist philosophical or theological project. So I completely agree with and would stand with, and it's very helpful the way you articulate it, and especially around Margaret Ebner and the particularities of the kind of both situatedness within a particular historical moment, and also a critical engagement with that historical moment that's operative in her text and in her work. So one quick thing about the context of this that I think speaks to the kind of problematic that you point to, and that is I was asked specifically to write a piece for a volume on feminist philosophy of religion. And this was a volume edited by Pamela Sue Anderson and Beverly Clack in response to what they saw as a need for some kind of feminist response to philosophy of religion as usual, right? And it was both of them were operating in a British tradition in which philosophy of religion has much more of a salient voice in the academy than I think it does here. And so there was this attempt to say, well, what would a feminist intervention in this look like? And Pamela Anderson has written, a book towards this end, as had Grace Janssen, and then Beverly Clack and others were working on it. So they asked me specifically to do something, and kind of open-ended. And my desire was very strong at that point to make this argument about practice and the ways in which, by allowing themselves or attempting to make an intervention into the field as it existed, right? There was that was always going to fall short unless one took practice seriously. And the reason being that as long as you're operating on the realm of ideas and beliefs, it's very easy for philosophers of religion to say, well, we abstract from gender. This doesn't have to do with gender. These embodied particularities are immaterial to belief and intelligible forms. Different ways people talk about it. And I think that as long as the body isn't brought into it and practices aren't brought into the discussion, there's always going to be this ability for sort of mainstream, if there is a mainstream philosophy of religion, to slide over precisely the questions about gender, sexual difference, sexuality, about race, about class, which in the Anglo case is a really vital issue, that are constantly being erased in these philosophical discussions. I think that your description, though, of theology as necessarily or demanding this interaction between beliefs and practices is absolutely right. And so then that raises the question of what's at stake for feminists engaging in work in religion, for me at this particular moment of time, for the broader discussions we're having, in keeping and maintaining a distinction between philosophy of religion and theology. Because one response to this whole sort of thing in terms of philosophy of religion is just to say, okay, you guys are doing something and it's kind of a dumb game and we're not interested in that. That's my general day-to-day response. When called upon to do something more, I was like, okay, I can do something more. But my stakes in it are quite low, and so that one of the issues for me was being able to say, okay, if you're going to try to do something, you need to do this. A, you need to pay some attention to what the object of belief looks like for some actually existing religious people, and B, that's grounded in particular practices in which people engage, and practices that are a fully theological engagement with religious life, religious ideas, religious entities and beings, whatever we want to however we want to talk about it. That doesn't mean for me a loss of the critical component, although in this piece I was mostly concerned to just get them to pay attention to, the fact that practice mattered. So that I think that one of the responses might be to say, well, what's at stake for people in saying, I do philosophy of religion versus I do theology? And there's a long and complicated history to that question. And I think one of the attempts that's operating in that is an attempt to gain a certain kind of legitimacy that for theology, precisely exactly what you said. Theology is seen as somehow subjective, somehow tied to revelation, somehow, not really rational, not really part of the modern American university. I actually heard a colleague of mine just last week say, well, here's my scholarly work, and then I also do this theological stuff. Literally, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna faint, but that's all right, because I actually do have a PhD in theology. I mean, I usually don't try to tell people that, but at moments like that, I'm like, damn it, I have a PhD in theology, and it is a scholarly activity. Damn it. Anyway, I got that in there twice. But anyway, so what's at stake? What's the cachet of saying you do philosophy versus the dismissal of theology? And how do we push against that, right? Which I think is absolutely huge. And also, what's the presumption that philosophy has a critical component or a strongly critical voice, and that theology doesn't? Which is something I've spent a lot of time in the last 4 years trying to fight with people about. Being invited to a conference where the question of the conference was, is critique secular? I was like, that's the dumbest question I've ever heard. Can that be my paper? Which was somehow not fully adequate. So I talked a little bit about how dumb it was in fuller form. I can elaborate. I won't elaborate here. I think probably we're all on the same page about the dumbness of that particular question. But it's really my theological categories are so finely tuned. But anyway, so I don't want to take up more time here. There's so much to talk about, but I think there's a really interesting question about the history of that distinction between philosophy of religion, theology, about where critique falls in that, where practice falls in that, about where the particular interventions that we as feminists and as others engaged in various forms of critique grounded in particular kinds of bodies want to use our energies. Quite simply, where it's worth it, where there can be an intellectual push that is going to do something and is going to have a particular power, a particular salience, and this is a very practical question, where we just say, look, you guys are not going to, this conversation's not going to change, so I'm going over here. But in doing that, what do we leave standing, and what are the dangers of what we leave standing? So how do we negotiate very practically in our intellectual and personal religious lives these decisions about where to take our stand, where we can take our stand, and what the limits of our own ability to put ourselves out there to be battered in whatever ways, intellectually and otherwise, are. Okay, so I'll leave with an oddly, for me, practical moment. And thank you all again. Thanks, Susan, again. Thank
you. Good evening. Let me first, my 10 minutes haven't started, correct, Shelley? Can I say thank you first? Thank you for allowing me to participate in this endeavor. Considering I'm not from the Boston area, but I'm in a small town of cornfields of Wilberforce, Ohio. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm even more gracious to respond to Dr. Copeland's work, whom I have admired over the years, but I've just met her today. And I'm equally grateful to be a part of my mentor's installation and this wonderful moment. Boston will forever be changed because of your presence. Hear the words of Toni Morrison. Hear the word of Toni Morrison from The Bluest Eyes. Quiet as it's kept, there were no marigolds in the fall of 1941. And by the way, I'm responding to Dr. Copeland's fresh off the press, this is a little pub, In Fleshing Freedom. You may want to buy it after we finish our exchange, our lovely moment. Okay, hear the word of Toni Morrison from The Bluest Eyes. Quiet as it's kept, there were no marigolds in the fall of 1941. We thought at the time that it was because Pensacola was having her father's baby that the marigolds did not grow. A little examination and much less melancholy would have proved to us that our seeds were not the only ones that did not sprout. Nobody's did. Not even the gardens fronting the lake showed marigolds that year. What is clear now is that of all of that hope, fear, lust, love, and grief, nothing remains but Pensacola and the unyielding earth. Choli breedlove is now dead, our innocence too. The seed shriveled and died, and her baby too. There is really nothing more to say except why. But since why is too difficult to handle, one must take refuge in how. Dr. M. Sean Copeland's work in Fleshing Freedom, Body, Race, and Being woke me up. I offer in these brief moments how, because to explain why would be, as Morrison has suggested, simply too difficult to handle. It means that I must first admit that I was dozing, nodding off. In a sense, that is what makes feminist practical theology feminist. It wakes us up. It compels us to move out of our insular safe havens and places us right at the heart of the unfolding human narrative, to listen, to mine, to gather, to commune, to see and feel what we can no longer escape. Professor Copeland does exactly that as she reads from both an intimate and public space the text of Black women's subjugated bodies in an American empire gone wild. In the opening words, she writes, "To the memory of Black women whose bodies were destroyed in the Middle Passage, whose bodies were abused and chewed up in the maw of slavery, whose bodies lie in unmarked and unattended graves, and to the memory of my grandmother, Mattie Hunt Billingsley, whose bodily labor made my freedom possible." Professor Copeland wakes us up before she even begins her theological anthropological exploration of, quote, what being human means on the body, most particularly on the bodies of Black women, end quote. She locates the suffering Black body at the center of her theological anthropology because it is, as she says, quote, at the heart of Christian belief, end quote. She writes, reflection on the body of Jesus of Nazareth and the bodies of Black women lays bare both the human capacity for inhumanity and the divine capacity for love. It is here that Professor Copeland helps us to see what makes feminist practical theology theology. It wakes us up to the divine within, to a Thomistic read that the flesh and body are not totally deprived. As she further notes, to speak of the enfleshing of created spirit through the struggle to achieve and exercise freedom in history and society, in this way, is to recognize that the Black body is a site of divine revelation and thus a basic human sacrament because the body is the medium through which the person as essential freedom achieves and realizes selfhood through communion with other embodied selves. Jesus of Nazareth is the paradigm of enfleshing freedom. He is freedom enfleshed. Theologically considered, she writes, Black women's absolute enfleshment of freedom is caught up and realized in the embodied presence of the resurrected body of Jesus. In a sense, this is what makes feminist practical theology practical. It is practical because oftentimes at the heart of our awakening, we feel a call to act, to enflesh freedom, love, openness, equality, mutuality, and solidarity, key themes that are central to Copeland's work. Her work calls the awakened to action, to work together, a work, she argues, that imposes a praxis of solidarity in the concrete, in the here and now, to work in community with the poor, the outcast, the sinner, the socially dysfunctional, and the sexually oppressed, end quote. It is a praxis of solidarity that apprehends us and connects us to the suffering of another and to confront and address its oppressive cause. Professor Copeland's work on the subjugation of Black women's body recasts that subjugation into an act of love and freedom on the part of Black women. This happens when Black women use their bodies as Christ did, as divine creative energy acting in the world, enfleshing freedom, love, and solidarity. Dr. Copeland's enfleshing freedom woke me up to the grace and gift of living, to the sobering humility I find in honoring the voices of the ancestors in my own work. Her words, as with other feminist, womanist writings, are our sobering reminder that once awakened, we may doze, but we can really never go back to sleep. Dr. Copeland's work dares us never to forget the embodied sacrifices of those who enfleshed freedom and bear witness of Christ's openness to the oppressed and excluded. Yet, it is the absolute overarching typology used as a prism to view Black women's embodied selves in a hostile American landscape that raises questions for me. Although it is understandable that Professor Copeland, a Catholic theologian, draws from theological constructs within her own tradition, I wondered as I read her text, number one, in Dr. Copeland's read of the scriptures, is there an implied Christological imperialism? Number two, is it necessary for womanists and feminist theologians to situate Black women's suffering, subjugation, resurrection, and freedom in Christology? Or is it possible for this typology to work within other faith traditions? Three, when women enflesh freedom and resurrect beyond sites of deprivation and suffering, are they not God incarnate, subverting, creating, acting, and bearing witness in the world or in the empire, as Copeland suggests? And four, what is at stake for women and cultures when they incorporate or hold onto biblical narratives that are grounded in male-dominated stories of conquest and male-dominated salvific hero figures? Professor Copeland provides us a framework for imaging alternative ways beyond a subjugated body to a free, loving, and loved body, alternate sites of hope and possibility beyond deprivation and oppression. I raise these questions within the context of my own work of exploring the harmful effects of a violent Christian language world on the psyche and well-being of Black peoples. Mary Daly has suggested that if God, quote, if God is male, then the male is God. The divine patriarch castrates women as long as he is allowed to live on in the human imagination, end quote. I wonder if we feminists and womanists have purged our minds of the divine patriarch who binds us to one story, one male savior hero figure, and one main event with one dominant lived theme. That theme is suffering for freedom. It can be argued that unless we, Black women, and perhaps all women, castrate the dominant myth that we drag along to seek meaning to our lives, our climaxes will be short-lived. In other words, I wondered as I read Professor Copeland's work, by relying or drawing from the Christian myth to guide our theorizing or experiences, is it possible to live out our ecstasy as women and into our fullest potential if the Euro-American Protestant defined biblical stories and its male hero figures are part of the interpreting process. Finally, let me say, it is good to be a part of a feminist, womanist tradition where the boundaries of gender-only analysis are being transgressed and the primacy of the interlocking realities of race, class, gender, and sexuality are moving front and center. Perhaps this tradition can be further enriched when our intentionality is also directed towards expanding the boundaries of our religio-cultural analysis, which draws from and welcomes voices and analysis of women's lived experiences outside of Christianity. It is in this vein that I offer Professor Copeland and all of us to consider and explore what actually does Dr. Copeland's fleshing freedom look like in an expanded, multi-religious world of the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank Professor Mary Elizabeth Moore, whose installation as Dean of the Boston University School of Theology has provided us with the occasion for this conversation and collaboration. I want to thank Dr. Shelley Rambo and her colleagues, Dr. Susan Abraham, Donna Freitas, and Renee Harrison, for their careful planning, attention to detail, graciousness, and early morning emails that have kept us all on track. I'm pleased to be here with Professors Hollywood and Paul Sell, and I'm grateful for the number of women faculty from the BTI who are here with us this afternoon. It's encouraging and I think harbingers many possibilities for conversation to come. I want to respond to the questions Dr. Harrison has raised in her reading of Enfleshing Freedom. And these questions bear quite directly upon the theological genre of my work, practical, political. Its fundamental presupposition, Christianity, Christian belief and practice, the basic question with which that work wrestles, social suffering, and its chief doctrinal locus, anthropology, Christology. So theological genre. Theology is an academic discipline, yet it dares to make a claim that no other academic discipline dares to entertain, or even desires to entertain. Theology declares that it functions as a mediating discipline between a cultural matrix and the significance and role of a religion within that matrix. Theology claims that it seeks critically to understand, to interpret, and to impart the Word of God and its meanings in various historical, cultural, and social contexts. Now, when such a theology deliberately hands over its cognitive praxis to the service of the poor, despised, and powerless in a given society, when it critiques the religious, cultural, social, and moral values within which it thinks, when it resists any attempt at theoretical confinement, when it unmasks all covert or pseudo-innocent support of whatever threatens the decreation of God's human creation, when it contests any reduction of knowledge, objectivity, reality, truth, and meaning, and when it calls attention to the peril to which Christianity exposes itself, when it submits to the privatization of the neoliberal market and closes its eyes to the life and mission and fate of Jesus of Nazareth, then that theology is resolutely practical political. I would hold womanist practical political theology accountable to the memory of chattel slavery with its erotic violence enacted upon the bodies of black women and its soul murder turned upon enslaved children and men, and to the memory of all the bodies of despised and powerless peoples piled up on our shores. That theology then unites the memory of such oppression and suffering to the memory of the tortured Jesus, who is no salvific hero buying us a celestial reward, but a just man who suffers injustice and whose resurrection protests imperialism in all its death-dealing forms in history. Memory of the crucified Jesus and of black women's bodies shredded in the maw of chattel slavery becomes in this context a dangerous memory. A memory which bears down on our present, makes demands on our future, places a claim on our hope, and breaks through our historical, cultural, and religious amnesia to expose that thick-crusted layer of intrinsic moral and social evil that James Cone has judged America's original sin. Now, as a practical political theologian, social suffering constitutes the basic question for my inquiry. Social oppression is what happens to human persons in social arrangements shaped by vicious historical, religious, cultural, social institutions and patterns. Social suffering is a way of categorizing the social injustice that children, women, and men endure. Social oppression includes sexism, racism in its hydra-headed virulent forms, including anti-Semitism, homophobia, xenophobia, directed at migrants and refugees, forms of social marginalization against the disabled or the aged, cultural imperialism, structural as well as random violence, and torture. Social oppression and social suffering are a fundamental practical theological concern for human and humane living, for human flourishing. Womanist practical political theology takes up social suffering and privileges the abused and broken bodies of black women. Privileging those suffering black bodies in theological anthropology uncovers the suffering body at the heart of Christian belief. Recall my Christian presupposition. Rather than serve a Christological imperialism, linking the broken body of Jesus and the broken bodies of black women allows for a re-narration of the relation between Christology and anthropology. Moreover, this uniting uncovers how Jesus' life and ministry contested all forms of hierarchy and repression and repudiated all dogmas and institutions that enslave, divide human beings one from another, crush the poor, imprison the rich in selfish luxury, abuse the infirm, and abandon the lonely. This portrait relies on a critical reading of the historical, political, and economic context of Jesus' life world. Thus, on a practical, political, theological account, Jesus' life and ministry, death and resurrection not only sign the reverse of empire in its brutal disposal of despised bodies, but also enacts that reversal in history, even if its complete realization cannot be grasped or incarnated fully in the here and now. Dr. Harrison asks whether the typological relation between Christology and anthropology is appropriate in other faith traditions. This question leads to the genre of comparative theology. It should be fruitful for a future conversation. But here I am unable to travel. But let me be clear, I neither reject the critical study of religions and religious studies nor other religions. Indeed, Roman Catholics acknowledge the operation of the Spirit outside of the church and far beyond its control. Rather, quite simply, my own effort at interdisciplinary research and control has circumscribed my engagement with this relatively new genre of theology. Finally, Dr. Harrison begins with a quote from Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, which concludes with this sentence: "There is really nothing more to say except why, but since why is difficult to handle, one must take refuge in how." In my own effort at practical womanist theology, I have been grappling with why and how. Infleshing Freedom constitutes my most sustained effort to try to thematize why womanist practical theology is womanist, why womanist practical theology is practical, and why womanist practical theology is theology. Thank you again, Dr. Harrison, and thank you again, Dr. Rambo.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Shelley, for all the planning that you've done, and also to Mary Elizabeth, who I've only met her. This is the second time today, and she greeted me with a hug. And so I feel like she's already bringing warmth into the School of Theology in this wonderful way. So thank you. And it's really exciting to be included on this panel of such dynamic women. So I'm excited about that. So I have a title for my talk, and it's Playing Around with Practice, Feminist Theology for Everybody, Even Your Dad. And I hope that Stephanie, I'm on a first name basis with Stephanie in this talk, so and I cleared that with her ahead of time, just FYI. And I hope she's okay with where I've decided to play. It's hot, but not as hot as it's going to get. This could be the first sentence of a novel or a memoir. I wish it was one of mine. But it's from Stephanie Paulzel's presidential address to the Society for the Study of Christian Spirituality. Titled Childhood and the History of Christian Spirituality, she had me at go, and there was more lush literary imagery to come. Stephanie transported us to the South and took us on a long drive with her father during her childhood. We hurtled through the humming green morning, saw flowers make breezy accusations of inattention, and heard the rattle and whine of insects, while she pondered a favorite sermon of her father's, Lost in the Mystery of God. This short, beautiful example of Stephanie's writing represents its most significant quality to me. How far, how wide, how invitingly she reaches out to a broad audience, especially in terms of form, whether giving a talk or writing for a popular magazine. She centralizes that which is often marginalized, the child and childhood, the family, a sense of place and home, and does so through vivid literary storytelling. She begins with the ordinary, the widely accessible, and moves us toward the practical, activities and reflections that are useful to spiritual and emotional well-being, that reach out to our spiritual sensibilities on personal and communal levels. She offers us practices that just about anybody can try out, rehearse, experiment with, and weave into their daily lives. In Stephanie's body of work, I find permission to practice feminist theology in the way I feel called. One major question we want to address over this year of conversations, panels, and talks is, why is feminist theology practical? Today, I will reflect on the words practice and practical in their most common familiar senses, and in light of how childhood, family, and home shape how these terms play out in our lives and what they might tell us about why feminist theology is practical. The way I used the term practice growing up usually related to sports and activities. Mom, can you pick me up after cheerleading practice? Yes, I was a cheerleader. Do you mind if I practice piano now? Practicing times tables for math class was also common, as was practicing letters when learning cursive. I practiced rolling homemade tortellinis with Grandma, too. I told students that writing takes practice and that we are going to practice our writing skills like mad over the semester, and which they just adore. Given the above, what do we learn? Well, practice is doing. It involves activity that challenges the body and the mind. To practice often requires us to switch locations, to leave home and then go back. Practice is often done in community with the help of peers and the guidance of a parent, teacher, coach, or mentor. It is intergenerational. It is occasionally done alone, but usually after guidance or direction has been offered. In going to practice, or in practicing something, we may have our eye on improving something we do, perhaps with repetition. Or maybe we try out something new, a new move, play, idea, to see how it turns out. Practice is a sphere in which we experiment. Practice can be a kind of rehearsal that happens before the official performance or game. Most of all, it is embodied. Practice is a workout of sorts. In my family, the word practical meant something useful and also widely necessary. You can't be a philosophy major. You'll never have a job. But an accounting major, now that's practical. Everybody needs accountants. Practical could also mean feasible or doable. It's not practical to say you'll meet friends in Providence if you don't have a car. Practical involved a certain amount of realism, asking, can this really be done? Do you have the money? Are the necessary structures in place to follow through on a particular aspiration? In light of the above, let's imagine what it would mean to say, I'm off to feminist theology practice. What would we do there? Would it employ the body, the intellect, both? Can we get dirty and sweaty during it, or would that ruin feminist theology practice? Is it communal or solitary? Who's there? Does it require us to leave home, and if so, does it allow us back, or must we leave permanently? What sort of mentoring or preparation would ready us for feminist theology practice? Can your son or daughter do it? What about your partner, your neighbor down the street, your mom, dad, grandma? Where is it located? Could we do it on a construction site? In the kitchen? What about at the local watering hole after work gets out for the day? In a nursery school class or a high school? Do you need special equipment? Is it easy to obtain, or is it prohibitively expensive? Is it exclusive to the few, open to anyone? When and where would we perform it when ready? Feminist theology is already practical in the sense that it is naturally intergenerational, passed on by our path-breaking theological mothers to us, and we in turn are passing it on. It is communal, requiring mentor teachers and students. And because it is often about communities and justice and how we might transform communities with justice. It challenges body image and is quite an intellectual workout, though so far does not require much of a physical workout, save certain forms of activism. We could posit that feminist theology is widely necessary, at least in theory and within the academy. But if we think about whether feminist theology is widely useful and called upon often, like for help on tax day, if we hope to call on childhood, family, and home, then its practicality might break down a bit. And this is where I'd like to push us a little this afternoon and talk about the joys of profanity. One of the most formative moments in my training as a feminist theologian came during graduate school, not in the classroom, but over a fax. Getting a PhD was a huge disconnect for my parents, especially between my dad and me. My parents not only initially disapproved, but none of what I was learning made sense to them. Feminist theology often speaks theoretically about places like my home. It is evocative of my community and family and its texts, but it rarely, if ever, speaks directly to my community and family. Then one day, my dad sent me an article from the Boston Globe that began, "Mary Daly is a world-recognized theologian and radical feminist philosopher," about her classroom controversy at Boston College. The note he scribbled on the cover page said, "Sweetheart, I saw this and thought you might want to read it." My reaction was one of joy. My dad made a connection to feminist theology because he read it in the Boston Globe. 8 years later, I published my first ideas piece there. I'd made feminist theology practical, i.e., accessible to my dad. I'd stretched my PhD all the way to home. To take a nod from my mom and dad and their desire that I make something useful of myself with this education they worked so hard to give me, ideally by becoming an accountant, I set out to make feminist theology as useful, as practical as H&R Block and TurboTax. And I find myself seeking out model feminist theologians who already do this, which is how I ran into Stephanie's work. Aspirations to include our families, childhood, home as a primary source and intended audience in our work does not make it simply nostalgic, unreal, watered down, lesser, or uncritical. It makes it conscious about class, economic situation, access to education, a consciousness that shows up through the genres, forms, and places we choose to publish, and the audience to whom we prioritize in this reaching out. Academia is a sphere of sanctioned classism, a world which creates hierarchies out of audiences, genres, and types of speech, a world that trains many of us to theorize, deconstruct, critique, and analyze the practices, lives, and rituals of people like our parents and friends from childhood, which in my case is white, very blue-collar, Italian, Irish, Portuguese, working class, as if they are not also our own, and as a means of retaining and even gaining academic credibility. To succeed in many ways, we must successfully learn to hide these particularities of ours as best we can, to silence the telltale accents that betray us, in order to become others,
to our childhood, familial, cultural, and social backgrounds, and to make others out of people like our parents. To truly reach toward home with our work often means to be marginalized by our peers. As a child, cursing can be a thrill, especially if you don't get caught. I feel like I've been cursing all the way through my time in academia. Like a curse word, much of the work of which I am most proud, I am also taught to hide. It's what we call service work, other and lower than our real work. This attitude goes against everything feminist theology has taught me. It is condescending. It doesn't respect my home, and I am sure the homes from where many people sitting here are from. To dismantle hierarchies, to truly transform our world, to make it just, we must transform the way we practice theology within the academy. We must profane it. Some of us, at least, must learn to curse. We must enter into that very thrill that is the curse word when it comes from the gleeful mouth of a child. Luckily, feminist theology has a long history of profaning the academy. The first generation of women scholars showing up was like one big long string of curse words. I am proud to participate in this tradition and to help push it as far as we all can go, and to do so without any more apologies, for me at least, until I can get all the way back home. Thank you.
So tempting to come up here and just unspool a string of curse words, but I won't. I'm so grateful to Susan and Shelley and all the organizers for inviting me to be part of this conversation. At Harvard, Susan has been helping us work more deliberately at the intersection of practical theology and feminist theology, with an emphasis on a more self-consciously global perspective. Just a few weeks ago in a faculty seminar, she jarred us out of our comfortable Western approach to pluralism with our emphasis on belief and dialogue among the right thinking by drawing on the resources of feminist practical theology that insists on keeping the realities of women's lives and women's bodies in view. I'm very glad to be here and to have this chance to keep learning from Susan and her colleagues in their important work. And it is an honor to have Donna Freitas speak to my writing. Donna is someone who, as her remarks suggest, has been listening very closely to what Maurice Sendak once called the world all around. She's been listening particularly closely to the voices of young people, and most especially to the voices of young women, who are struggling to speak of the things that matter most to them, the mysterious shaping power of the books they love, the vulnerabilities and expectations that shape their sexual lives, their relationship to the families within which and against which they define themselves. Donna has brought her expertise in feminist theology and feminist philosophy to her extraordinary cultural work. She has excavated spiritual guidance from Bridget Jones and a robust theology from the atheological Philip Pullman. She has listened carefully to college students talk about the culture of hooking up and how these sexual encounters shape their relationships and their understanding of themselves. And most recently, she has told a story about the spiritual aspirations of a 15-year-old girl growing up Catholic in Rhode Island in her first novel, The Possibilities of Sainthood. For Donna, a college student struggling with the sexual demands of her campus culture, or a girl growing up in an immigrant family, have as much need of and as much right to the resources of theology as any of us in this room. And she is working hard to make theological resources available to those who need them in a way that is both witty and learned, inviting a wide range of people to receive them and make use of them in their own lives. This is a very great gift, and one I can only imagine has opened windows and doors in the imaginations of many of her readers who may never have heard of practical theology or feminist theology, but who have been invited into the practice of these disciplines by a generous, gifted thinker and writer. So I'm honored by Donna's attention to my work and grateful for her insights. One of her most helpful insights for me is the way Donna has described work in practical and feminist theology as work that can be experimented with, work that can be tried on and tried out. Practice is a sphere in which we experiment, she says. Theology is also such a sphere, I think, as is feminism. Even the imperious Simone Weil admits that the certainties she was so fond of proclaiming in no uncertain terms are only experimental certainties. If we do not believe in them before experiencing them, she writes, if at least we do not behave as though we believed in them, we shall never have the experience that leads to such certainties. Weil acknowledges here a basic insight of both practical and feminist theology, that we don't always think our way into new ways of acting, but very often, as Susan and Amy show through their reflections on Marguerite Ebner, also act our way into new ways of thinking. We experiment with our ideas, try them out in our writing, our living, our teaching, and see what they look like in the face of analysis and critique, or in the lives of those we hoped that these ideas would help. It's when we stop experimenting, when we come to believe that our insights as theologians and feminists are too precious to experiment with, that it becomes difficult to move our work forward because we have become resistant to change. If practice is a sphere in which we experiment, then the practice of writing certainly qualifies. Donna asks, what would it mean to say, I'm off to feminist theology practice? For most of us, it means, I'm going to try to find a quiet spot where I can sit down and write. That quiet spot, though, is rarely very quiet. We might be writing in the midst of a busy household or in a cafe with the hum of conversation all around us. But even if we have the perfect spot, cool and quiet, it is usually filled up all the same with voices. Voices telling us to write this, not that. Voices saying, this kind of writing won't get you anywhere. That kind of writing will be held against you. Are you sure you want that on your CV? And of course, the voice that always seems louder than all the others, a voice that sometimes comes to us sounding like a parent or a colleague or a boyfriend or a teacher from long ago, you can't do it. You can't write. Why don't you just give up? It's a wonder we can get any feminist theology practice done at all. Donna urges us to resist these voices by embracing the long feminist history of profaning the academy. Stop apologizing, she tells us. Learn to curse. Do the work you most want and need to do, even if it is work the voices tell you to hide. Service work, she calls it. Work that the voices tells us is other and lower than our real work. And that's the question, isn't it? What is our real work? And who gets to say what our real work is? On this panel and in this room are scholars of practical and feminist theology who work in a variety of forms. Some of us are drawn to the theoretical and find there the resources to pull our lens back far enough to begin to discern some patterns in what we study that we couldn't see with our lens close up. It's not always the codes of academic purity, I think, that keep us in these theoretical modes. Sometimes it's just that theory is illuminating. I learned this from Amy Hollywood. Others of us take a more narrative approach, bringing our lens close in on a particular story, a particular life. Some of us find our best sources in old books, and others of us do our interpreting among living human documents. And of course, there are lots of us who move around among these forms and methods and others besides. Should we all write in a voice and a language that our parents could understand? I do think we have to learn from Donna that doing so does not make us uncritical, rather it makes us conscious. I really like that. But I don't think we all have to do it, at least not all of us and all the time. No one of us can do all the work that feminist or practical theology needs done. Some of us will have to do some very theoretical work using very, very specialized language, while others of us will speak in a voice that a wide range of people, even our parents, could understand. What is required of all of us is that our writing be a form of attention. The poet C.D. Wright says that writing saves me from missing a minute of what would otherwise go unpondered, unqualified. Practical theology and feminist theology share so much in common, and not least is the commitment to bring into the realm of analysis realities that so often go unpondered and unqualified in theology. Donna has named some of them: the child and childhood, the family, the body, the sense of place and home, but there are many more, many, many more. Practical theology and feminist theology both came into being when pioneering scholars attempted to bring the resources of theological thinking into conversation with women's lives, women's bodies, and the messy, complex realities of living communities. This is work that requires the best of us, a quality of attention that won't allow us to get comfortable with our strengths in theory or analysis or narrative or lyricism. Practical theology and feminist theology both require us to stretch, sometimes well past the point of our strengths and into realms less familiar. This is risky, I suppose, but exhilarating as well. And there's nothing like seeing a scholar put her anxiety aside, her anxiety about her CV or what her colleagues will think or what her field demands, to do the work she most needs to do. A few years ago, Amy Hollywood, gave a lecture at HDS, which began as a highly theoretical and very illuminating analysis of key texts of Freud and Melanie Klein on mourning and melancholy. But it ended, as Amy had discovered in the course of practicing and experimenting that it had to, with a story, a fiction, grounded in a story from Amy's own life, her life passed, as Emerson would put it, through the fire of thought. That she did not choose one form or one way of thinking over the other was thrilling to me, because it reminded me, as I need to be reminded, that at their best, the disciplines of scholarship make room for questions that require all kinds of form and language to answer. At their best, our disciplines of practical theology and feminist theology give us room to ask our fiercest questions and the freedom to pursue those questions in whatever form will allow us to go into the deepest, most hidden places and come out again, ready to place our work down next to each other's work, ready to create a new map. This is our real work.
There was a reason I didn't want to go last. It's hard acts to follow. Just a public service announcement. If you do have a question that's been brewing up in you, Atula's over there and can take the questions. I should just say, it is a fool who engages the work of her dean. I'm not sure how that came about in our discussions. She is a fool. This will have particular resonance for those who heard Mary Elizabeth's installation sermon last week, which was titled Spirit Speaks. That was the theme that it ended on. So that's how I will begin. Heading into doctoral exams, a graduate student friend and I were comparing reading strategies. His strategy: read the first chapter, the last, and the index. He assured me that you can get to the heart of an argument that way. My strategy? Well, I told him that I always started with the preface. He compared my fascination for prefaces with audiences needing human interest stories in the midst of sporting events. It's a sideline show, ancillary, and definitely not necessary for comp exams. I didn't think much about it then, but I've been thinking a lot about prefaces and the future of feminist practical theology. In the early modern period, 16th and 17th centuries, prefaces were strategic sites in which British women writers were forging their way into the writing world. The preface, the seemingly harmless introduction to the main text, provided a unique and culturally sanctioned space for women to establish their identities as writers. Julie Eckerle and Anne Larson claim that the preface became a kind of strategic topoi for women writers in this time. It was here that they often engaged in polemics and defenses of the sex. The preface was a place in which the woman writer claimed authorial voice and began to build a readership. Yet it was precisely the fact that the preface was expected to be underwhelming and preliminary that made these bold moves possible. My curiosity piqued by these literary studies, I've spent the past few weeks scouring the prefaces of early feminist and womanist theological texts. What's going on in this seemingly innocuous space of the theology book? Thinking about the strategic topoi of the preface, I began to envision the work of the preface differently. First, I want to invite us to think about the preface as a haunting story, a ghost story. Second, I want to suggest that the future of feminist theology is bound up in the preface, and more specifically, in teaching the preface. But first, ghost stories. Hush, listen to Letty Russell. I have always found it difficult to walk away from the church, but I have always found it difficult to walk with it. Hush, listen to Dolores Williams. My very last words of preface are these: I pray this book will also speak in a meaningful way to African American women. Hush, listen to Carol Christ and Judith Plaskow. We cannot say that we have not paid for our choices. Hush, listen to Ada Maria Sassi Diaz. As a Mujerista theologian, I straddle the academic and the Latino worlds. Hispanic women are indeed my community of accountability, but I am an academic woman. Hush, listen to Mary Elizabeth Moore. Day by day, I know more of the dangers of being a multidisciplinary person in academia. I fit in many places, but I do not fully fit in any one place. Confessions, betrayals, refusals, prayers, and testimonies. The prefaces are filled with them. As women theologians attempted to make their way into the main text of theology, they employed the preface to tell the stories of struggles for recognition and legitimacy, about the costs of bringing to light experiences of those not deemed main text worthy. They tell stories about being sidelined and left out of the canons of histories of religious traditions. The stories are tangled and raw, hopeful and despairing, complex. Feminist and womanist theologians give privileged status to stories, and many convey a strong belief in the transformative power of telling and hearing stories. In Mary Elizabeth Moore's work, she views stories as lived texts, not ancillary to the stuff of theology, but constitutive of it. The stories are not merely illustrative, they often disrupt and transform our familiar paradigms, turning us towards new insights and visions for the future of our disciplines. Stories figure large in these prefaces. But I wonder, nearly 2 decades after many of these were written, if we hear and receive a particular kind of story from these prefaces. Rereading them, I want to suggest that they function in the present as ghost stories, haunting the present terrain of feminist theologies. If we peer for a minute into the places where many of us teach and minister, everything looks quite respectable. In the academy, departments and theological schools have hired their feminist, womanist, and mujerista scholars. Feminist courses are on the books and taught and offered regularly. Pulpits are filled with women ministers. The Lilly Endowment is funding our programs. We can say that there's no need for dramatic prefaces, no need for polemical defenses of the legitimacy of the field and feminist inquiry. We have arrived. Once dangling on the margins, we have made our way into the main text. Yet the prefaces speak to a kind of haunting that persists, only now in spectral form. In these prefaces, I am reminded of the repetitions of academic divisions and the wounds that are not fully healed. The ghosts hover over, under, and in the present configurations of things. Old wounds can be triggered with the mere mention of these words: real, rigorous, serious theology, tradition, orthodoxy, academic excellence. The ghosts also live within our more familiar terminologies, perhaps at the intersections of these terms: theory and praxis, church and academy. They live on in the bodies of those of us whose theological identities are crafted out of these divisions. Trauma theories and post-colonial theories each have ways of speaking about this haunting, about what remains long after an event of violence or a period of territorial occupation is over, about what it means to be constituted by pasts that are complex and difficult to discern. They tell us that if we do not attend to these ghosts, we are in danger of operating out of these affective wounds. In Ghostly Matters, sociologist Avery Gordon speaks about ghosts and haunting. Gordon wants sociologists to account for what she calls complex personhood, for the ways in which histories, particularly histories of violence, live on in us and constitute our present lives. Gordon says that we must learn how to make contact with what is without doubt often painful, difficult, and unsettling. Ghosts and haunting are signs that life is more complicated, more layered, more enigmatic. This requires different forms of inquiry that attend to what she calls the seething absences and muted presences of our historical realities. She claims, being haunted draws us effectively, sometimes against our will, and always a bit magically, into the structure of feeling of a reality we come to experience, not as cold knowledge, but as transformative recognition. When I think about the history of feminist and womanist theologies, I am increasingly aware of its ghosts. I think about the ways in which the divisions that we seek to transcend live on in us. The wounds of the past inhabit us. The push in early feminist theology was to have women tell their stories. Although this task should never go away, I find that there's an equally important task posed to us by these prefaces: to reckon with the ghost stories, to find ways of speaking about and accounting for the wounds that remain and that dangerously operate in the present. The preface haunts, but it offers a strategy as well, a strategic topoi for feminist practical theologians. Should we aspire to assimilate into the main text, or should we in some way claim our prefatory status, finding new strategies for haunting the main texts of our traditions, different forms of inquiry that can speak to complex personhood, new forms of speech, new ways of writing theology, new pedagogical practices? This leads me to my second point, teaching. Each time I approach the Feminist and Womanist Theologies course, I struggle to figure out how to teach the class. From syllabus construction to the first couple of weeks of class, I revisit the history of the feminist movement, wondering if and how these materials will be met by students in the classroom. Increasingly, the issues and concerns of early feminist and womanist theologians are not translating. Day one this semester, putting the terms womanist and feminist on the board, I couldn't find a person in the room who would line up under either of these terms. Suspicions up, I began to feel defensive, as if the sole apologist for the feminist and womanist scholars who preceded me. The cartoon-like bubble over my head reads, perhaps the feminist movement has failed. Perhaps feminist theology was merely the fad, the special interest theology that those on the main text, in the main text suggested that it was. Perhaps it's time to close the books on courses like this, feminist theology out of business. However, in reading these prefaces, I discovered what it is that I do. I teach the preface. In the teaching of feminist and womanist theologies, I'm not asking students to get on board with a set of issues. Instead, I'm teaching them strategies for negotiating the world when they're not in the main text. I increasingly understand the value of feminist theologies to be the lens that it provides for looking at the world, a window into mechanisms of the academy, the church, the way that power functions. In Teaching from the Heart, Mary Elizabeth Moore claims that it is not so much the matter, the material, that counts in our teaching, but the energy, the spirit. Rather than an apologist for a body of material, I track spirit, detecting what falls between the lines, the muted presences and seething absences that never make it into the main text. This pedagogy of the preface involves providing tools for discerning the multi-layering of lives, the effective wisdom needed to live on the margins of the main text. In my comments, I have been moving in the realm of spirits, religious and theological territory, some might say. Theologians Mark Klein Taylor and Rebecca Chopp both speak of the work of theology as tracking spirit, as the ability to detect and identify life in unexpected places. There is an awe, reverence, and wonder in this spirit work, according to Mary Elizabeth Moore. The haunting is not a wholly negative thing, and neither is it ethereal or disembodied. But I wonder if the theological task of feminist practical theologians addressing the question, what makes feminist practical theology theological? I wonder if the theological task will require strange and peculiar moves to recover terms like the Holy Ghost, to find ways of tracking stories that cannot be told, to take seriously the ways in which death returns, making claims on the living. The womanists whisper, hush, hush, listen. The mothers are speaking. Do we hear them?
Exquisite, Shelley. And Susan, and Amy, and Renee, and Sean, and Donna, and Stephanie. Thank you. What have we been doing this afternoon? Reconstructing worldviews, reconstructing, inventing habitus, questioning suffering and Christocentrism, engaging suffering, and making deep meaning of it. Returning home and cursing boldly, embracing our most penetrating questions in whatever forms we must write and express ourselves, moving prefaces to the center, to the main body of the text, but not really. These are feminist practices. These are glimmering stars of women's practical theology, shaping a constellation, lighting our paths. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Shelley Rambo is a ghost writer who invites ghosts into our presence, as well as the engagement of women scholars and writers with ghosts of their own lives and their contextual worlds. In Korea, people understand that ghosts walk the streets, and people sometimes put food at their gates to appease and satisfy the ghosts. In some studies of ghosts in the United States, people argue that ghosts are spirits that have unfinished business and are not able to release themselves fully from earthly life. They inhabit spaces where they try ephemerally to complete their earthly work. With those perspectives on ghosts, Shelley Rambo's connection of ghost to trauma are fitting. Trauma is leftover tragic business that indwells our bodies. tragic remnants that we cannot let go until the business is done. To that end, I want to name in this preface some of my own unfinished business. It is an invitation to the next generation of work in feminist and womanist theologies, feminist, womanist, mujerista, Asian women's practical theology. First is the ghost of feminization, the ghost of practical theology and many of its forms like pastoral care and education as feminized, marginalized disciplines. Second is the ghost of women themselves, women in systematic liberation, constructive theologies, and women in practical theology, often the margin of the margins. Focus for a moment on practical theology. If the whole discipline is largely feminized, men in the discipline experience a marginalized status themselves. They are very much aware often that they have chosen this field and thereby chosen the status. They are therefore not always the most receptive audience, understandably, to hearing that women within their field experience unique forms of marginality and women of color experience particularly unique and intense forms. If I had written this preface several years ago, I would have said, as I did in some prefaces and essays, that my choices of practical theology and religious education were self-conscious and happily chosen. However, I did pay a price. I wondered why my books were read less and reviewed less than those of my white male colleagues. I wondered why my contributions seemed so valuable to the communities in which I engaged, at least in terms of being asked to carry very large workloads, but why I was easily tossed aside as a person of little value. My personal concern has become smaller and smaller as I have become older and older. But my social concern has become larger and larger. The low status of the field is really a place of privilege from which practical theologians and women in practical theology, and indeed in all of theology and philosophy of religion, have the ability to see some dynamics that are far more serious than their status. It is a privilege that gives freedom to function in forging innovative, intellectual paths, and as Donna has said, innovative ways, forms of expressing ourselves. And it is a privilege not to be revered. It is a privilege not to be revered, and thus not to be quite so tempted to lose our souls to popularity. In spite of this privilege, feminist, womanist, mujerista, Asian women, practical theologians all walk to the edge of the abyss. The abyss may be the pioneering of controversial approaches to counseling with prostitutes, developing Shelley Rambo's theology of Holy Saturday, developing theology and liturgy in communities with massive deaths to AIDS, questioning theologies that glorify suffering, developing a theology of a disabled God, engaging in community organizing where people are embroiled in deep racial, social class, and sexual difference conflicts. Abysses are real, and that is where we belong. Women and men alike. I am grateful that I still drip with fury when white women overspeak Asian, African American, and Latina women. I drip with fury when the religious practices of some communities deeply related to the life histories of those communities are identified as orthodox, and those of other communities equally deeply connected to the life histories of those communities are identified as heretical. I drip with fury when systematic theology is valued over practical theology, biblical studies valued over the studies of living communities, preaching valued over the practices of pastoral care or education. I drip with fury when self-identified practical theologians like me are so preoccupied with their place in the academy or definitions of the discipline that we give no attention to our responsibility, to our faith, and to our world. I drip with fury when self-identified feminist theologians, womanists, mujerista, Asian women theologians in other fields belittle the work of practical theology or place it in a very small box. I drip with fury when people identified with practical theology are expected, like me, to keep the church moving in the same direction, or to attend to internal church matters with little or no attention to Christian practice in the world, and little, if any, recognition that practical theology itself can be interreligious. But here we are, with diverse disciplines, contexts, ethnicities, and points of view. We are coming together in this place with the leadership of young women, and we are not entertaining the old ghosts. Let's say to the ghost of credibility and status, you can leave now. We have work to do, and we need to get on with it. We can say to the ghost of women who have lived on the margins, thank you. You have been great. Now, please help us move to the next season of this work. Breathe your pioneering spirits upon us so we can pioneer in new ways, but don't expect us to do our work the way you did yours. Young women, don't let us expect you to do your work the way we've done ours. We can say to the ghost of small expectations, tiny categories, and domesticating, colonializing pressures, break out of your boxes and get out of here. You have done your work, and we need now to create new spaces where we can do new work and breathe freely. On the other hand, we need to ask the ghosts of gender destruction, racial destruction, sexual difference destruction, earth destruction, to continue haunting us. But these ghosts of destruction, if allowed free rein, form a habitus of death. Communicated well by Grace Janssen's last works on violence, in which she critiqued the necrophilia that dominates popular imagination and Christian theologies, arguing that we need instead to create a habitus of natality or life. We still need those awesome, awful ghosts of destruction as warnings, but we need to ask them to spend most of their time in the walls. We need the warnings against colonialism, domestication, patriarchy, racism, heterosexism, sexism, and oppression in all of its forms. We do not need these ghosts to lead all of our meetings, because we need now to construct a habitus of life, a habitus not yet formed. So let's say to the ghost of oppression and violation, we still need you, but you need to take a new role now. We have work to do, and we need your help. We need your help to become realistic analysts of our world, while not repeating the same old conversations. We need your help now to clear pathways to become justice builders, earth lovers, people nourishers, and daring prophets. May this constellation light the way. And as we move into the next phases and receive the light from all of the constellations represented in this room, may we find those paths opening before us.
Thank you so very much to everybody on the panel. This was very inspiring in a very personal way for me. Well, we collected 4 questions, and I did go ahead and reframe them, so I'm very sorry if I'm going to hurt anybody or diss anybody, etc. I'm sorry. This is, in some ways, actually, Dean Moore's comments, they have addressed these questions, but I will reframe the ones that were asked for a little bit of discussion. The first one, what exactly is the distinction, or how do we make a distinction between feminist theology and feminist practical theology? This will take a whole book. So we're going to try and do this in 3 minutes. So I'm going to say, just recount these questions and, let it simmer here while people think about it. So what is the distinction, if any, between feminist theology and feminist practical theology? Another question, who exactly speaks for feminist practical theology? That is, those of us, or let's see, the absences represented here could be in terms of race, could be in terms of class, it could be in terms of gender, or whatever marker of difference you have. What are the absences represented, or obviously not represented here, and how do we speak feminist practical theology in light of those absences? Another question, how do contemporary theories, sociological theories of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc., play a role in practical theology? And finally, how do we speak about God? Mm-hmm. So very simple questions. Shall we? So the first one, is there, or how do we maintain, what exactly is the distinction between feminist theology and feminist practical theology?
Can I say something starting at the other end
Yes.
of the questions?
Sure.
It's just been in my mind listening to all of this, and I did also wanted to be sure to have 1 second just to say how much I appreciated this event and how much I appreciated all that I heard today, and was really, I almost cried up here, profoundly moved by what I heard today. And I just wanted to sort of say that. And that has to do, I think, I'm not a person who generally likes to talk about God very much, except for in the abstract. This is what X thought about God. And I was thinking about it, though, and it was in the words where Donna, and I can't remember who was, I think it was you said it, oh shoot, I'm not going to find it now, where you said that you'd stretched your PhD all the way home, which is really incredibly moving for me, and I think for lots of us who come from very different sorts of backgrounds, and for whom that stretch looks different depending on who you are and where you are, but I think is really important. And for me, I realized in telling stories that Stephanie made reference to this one paper where I sort of tell a fictional story about my brother, and that for me, God is in that stretching all the way home. That I can't locate a God in a absolutely transcendent space. I can't think about God in the terms that are most readily theologically available, even still in our post-process, post-this, post-that systematic theological universe. I can think about God as occupying the spaces between people and between persons and communities, and in that attempt to reach across and stretch, and the need to move. I had to go away from home, before I had something to say back to home. I had to go away and be somewhere else and do other things before I could do consciously what you describe in that moment, and I don't know if I've accomplished it yet. So that's just a very simple and inadequate, but something I wanted to say about when I speak about this stretching towards home, when I speak about my family, when I speak about my work and the people I write about in the Middle Ages in relationship to things in my life, I may not look like or sound like I'm speaking about God, but that's where God is for me. That was an oddly confessional moment on my part. Okay, we're going to move on to. Now I'm not going to talk anymore.
Is anybody else?
I think, and I would agree as well, and this might be a bit ambiguous, but for me, I think when we speak of God. And sometimes that's clear, and sometimes it's not as clear. But our very beingness is God. And so, and for me, this is why I kind of struggle through these typologies, these absolute typologies. Our moment together is God speaking. As simple as that.
So just to push you a little bit in terms of the questions, a question I have here. So if that is God, Renee, and if we are in agreement, how do we mobilize that inclusive understanding of God to speak to the other one? The more transcendent, distant,
Yeah.
Mary Daly God.
Yeah. I think if I'm hearing Amy correct, is that this transcendent God is just, that's the problem. that is the problem. Yeah. It's just as simple as this gathering. People are moved and respond and go out, hopefully, and in some ways enact God.
I wonder, though, if there's room for what Amy's husband Ray used to call Mr. Far Near. Marguerite Perret, who Amy wrote on for her dissertation, talked about God as loin près, far near, far nearness. So near, but also far. Yeah, which is the stretch. Yeah, well, maybe that's it. Maybe it's the stretching between far and near. Okay. I'm happy with that. I just didn't want to.
It's not no transcendence.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for transcendence.
Yeah.
Because I think we hear. I understand how this could be and probably is a moment of profound religious engagement, despite its seemingly intellectual framework. And I believe, as a Christian, that if we're gathered in the name, then God's among us, God's present here. But I don't want to identify in any form of absolute way this gathering with God, because because we don't really know who's here.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So I don't want to lose transcendence. I don't want to lose transcendence. I don't think that's in the end fair to all of us here, number one. And number two, I don't think it's fair for people who believe in God to God. So I would be. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the religious experience and to the feeling. I'm sympathetic to the feeling, because religion is also feeling. But I'm a little suspicious of the definition.
Well, can I respond?
Yeah, you go. Yeah.
I'm not saying that there is no transcendence. I'm saying the problem is the focus is so much there that we forget the encounter in the room. So that it is both far and near. I'm saying the transcendent is the problem when it becomes so other that we forget the richness of this divine moment of God speaking.
I just want to weigh in on this, because I think when I said the ghost haunting these divisions that we have, immanence and transcendence is one, as I teach feminist theology, that comes up all the time. As soon as you say, the fear of collapsing God into the order of the world, and when students watch me going in that direction with the material, this sense of like, well, then what? And I think that what feminists and womanists have done well is to try to have moments of the divine touching flesh, of that kind of embodiment that had been lost in the sense of transcendence. So, and to try to reframe that. But I think that's one of our ghosts. I hear that all the time in the literature, that as soon as you move in this, feminists are giving up transcendence, then the easy dismissal happens, right? That's, then I can't go there. So I'm interested in thinking about how we can reframe that intersection instead of being kind of haunted by that, to not lose students who really are searching for some sense of their world pulsing with the sacred. I mean, I think there is that hunger there, and if we meet it with the same division, we fail to speak, I think.
I would agree with that, and I mean, insofar as I think that what we've done with transcendence is perhaps idealize it, so that it becomes an idol in which it really becomes then detachable from. I'm trying to hang on to my classical theism. I recognize that, and I'm not ashamed of it.
Yeah.
But I because it's an important commitment. But I think you're right. If we start to think about this as both, it's a funny word to say, but we're absolutizing what is already absolute, and in that sense, it becomes problematic. But your other point, your last point, it touches into exactly what, Shelley, what you described as one of Dean Moore's gifts. I'm trying to find it right now. I'm missing it, but it's the piece on the sacramental, teaching as a sacrament. So here there is this sense of the world being shot through with little chips of what Benjamin says, messianic time, or little chips of sacramental time, if you like. Yeah.
I appreciate your follow-up question, Susan, because I do think the question gets posed. We have to wrestle with the question of then how do we communicate God with one another, with others, and so forth. And I recall that when Nell Morton years ago was asked why she insisted on calling God she and woman, she said, I learned that from James Cone. James Cone said, you can't change perspectives if you're not iconoclastic. If I had said God is black and white, that would have had no effect. And so she made a strategic decision to say that God is woman. She said, I'm not making, that's a strategic decision. And that's what I appreciate about this conversation between Renee and Sean, by making strategic claims, whether they're exactly the claims you're going to make forever or whether you're going to nuance them in the next day. I think those strategic claims are the ways in which we communicate, and we need to become more agile in that. Because when Shelley's example of the nervousness about making, that people often have with feminist theologies, is an example of how difficult it is to deal with iconoclastic or even bold claims about God. And I think that's part of our mission as theologians, to do that. And I'm panentheistic, so it's easy for me to say that.
Stephanie, were you going to say something?
No.
Donna, do you want to weigh in? No?
Oh, Susan, you must.
I must.
You must weigh in on this.
Well,
As soon as the word strategy comes up, Susan perks up.
Well, I was actually remembering an incident from my childhood when these wonderful people were speaking about God. It was a very long time ago, and I was very young, and I started this big argument with my parish priest about God. And of course, he was my parish priest, and therefore knew everything about God. And who was I who didn't know anything about God? And my thing was, this was our argument, where is Hitler? Is Hitler in hell, or did Hitler have the possibility of heaven? His argument was Hitler is absolutely in hell. There is no possibility at all that Hitler could have gone to heaven. And my thing was, I'm very uncomfortable with that, because what kind of a God just totally condemns radically with no hope, nothing, even for, the demon, the thoroughly demonized understanding of Hitler that, in India people have. It took me many years to think about what I was struggling with, which is how do we understand God's activity in the world? Well, I don't know where Hitler is, but one might understand if one dehumanizes in the way that the systems dehumanized that he oversaw, then he would be in a dehumanized place. That makes sense now. But that God would send him there doesn't sit well with me. Because we must have a bigger God than the God of our agendas, even if our agendas are for liberation. This was my intuition. And it took me very many years. It took me 25 years to come up with an understanding of a God that was bigger than even my liberation agenda. So I like to speak of transcendence, but not in the dualistic way that makes transcendence unrelated to immanence. Mm-hmm. So when I speak about God, I want to talk about God, who is this near far, but I like to use categories because I think that's where the mushiness creeps in. Because we do not know what immanence really means, and therefore we do not know what transcendence means. So that's my answer. Do we want to take on one more? I think we're out of time. We could go on forever like this. This is the point of this discussion. How much time do we have?
No time.
We have no time. Well, I should say thank you on behalf of the panel to you all and to the panel for, we sent out invitations and all of these women responded with tremendous generosity and graciousness. So thank you to one and all.